Wonderful. Okay, well, we're gonna kick off. Thank you everybody for having us. As Hannah mentioned, my name is Hagar. I'm host of weekly world news show on YouTube called Oh My World. Please go subscribe. And I spent 12 years in the US government working in different national security and public affairs positions, mostly in sanctions, the Middle East, Asia, counterterrorism, and human rights. And expand the gamut. We can talk about it later. Who I want to introduce is our distinguished guest, Misha Zelinsky, who is the assistant national secretary of the Australian Workers Union, and he is here in the United States as a Fulbright scholar with the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, which is sponsored by the Australian-US Ministerial Consultations for him to focus specifically on Indo-Pacific issues. So we're very lucky to have him today as he focuses specifically on this. Misha is also the host of the Diplomates podcast, so make sure to check that out wherever you get your podcasts. Misha, let's start out at the 60,000 foot level. And to dive in, let's start simple with why AUKUS is important in general. Why is this deal such a big deal?
Well, it's a massive announcement, right? I mean, when I think about it in the context of Australians' policy, this is pretty much the biggest Australian foreign policy decision since the signing of ANZUS Treaty between the United States and Australia in 1951. Which is a mutual defence pact. So that's 70. We've just had the 70th anniversary of ANZUS here in Australia and in the United States. And the AUKUS deal, I think, will have the status of ANZUS going forward. So it is a huge announcement. It's very profound. Now, it's had a bit of a rough landing. I think we sort of there was some discussion at the beginning there introducing it, but overall, this is a huge deal from the United States perspective. The United States has only shared its nuclear technology with one other party, that's the United Kingdom, the other party to AUKUS, and that was in 1958. So, this has not happened for, over 60 years, this sharing of this technology with any other party. So that's the level of trust between the three parties. So, and I think what's really interesting about it, no secrets hold in politics, and this decision didn't leak at all. And I actually think that was quite an extraordinary thing in the sense that, for a big policy decision like that to have zero leaks on it, I think just, again, demonstrates the level of trust between the three parties. Now, why has it been necessary? Well, what's changed? I mean, why did Australia have to change this decision when, in 2016, Australia thought that its strategic needs were for diesel submarines? And why, have we had to make this decision now to pursue nuclear submarines via AUKUS? Now, of course, AUKUS is not just about nuclear subs, but that's where a lot of the focus has been because of the diplomatic spat. Firstly, I think the title of this session sort of talks about conflict. I think we should absolutely seek to avoid conflict. Nothing is inevitable. We should never sort of, blindly consider that we're walking into something that, this is all just heading one way. That's sort of the kind of thinking that got us into World War I, and that would be a disaster. But we can't be Pollyannish about what's changed in our region, in the Indo-Pacific. And the truth of the matter is you've got a much more assertive Chinese Communist Party under Xi Jinping, certainly since 2016, but even before that. You're seeing increasing air sorties over Taiwan. You're seeing the crushing, regrettably, of Hong Kong, the bullying of regional neighbours with its fishing fleet, the militarizing of the South China Sea through construction of islands, and then essentially refusing to acknowledge freedom of navigation, the law of the sea. So, AUKUS, may have been signed in Washington, but it's certainly made in Beijing.
Right. It's funny you say that because I actually find that personally, since the pandemic, I find it's Chinese aggressive behavior has exacerbated, right? It almost. And there could be many reasons for it, right? As you and I have previously discussed, some of it is related to President Xi's own desires to hold on to power, to put himself on the level of past Chinese leaders. But also perhaps that the world was distracted, right? When things got really difficult last year, it felt like suddenly all the efforts that he was pursuing in human rights abuse and aggressive behaviors in the neighborhood, like Hong Kong and Taiwan, and behavior in the South China Sea and so on, just progressively got worse. And so let's hone in a little bit on China in particular and this behavior. And first, how much do you think AUKUS does provide this balance of power and push back on China effectively? Is there any risk that it could anger them further to the point where it causes military aggression? Right? China's not going to be happy about it, of course, but does it adequately help provide this balance of power with China? Let's dive in a bit more on the China question.
Yeah. So I think, the Chinese Communist Party's response to AUKUS was very muted, which I think was interesting. It told us that I think that they were surprised by it. They didn't see it coming, and they're nervous about it because they understand that, having that level of, three maritime powers, coordinating via technology, and it's not just submarines, it's other technologies as well, in the area, I think is profound. And then when you overlay that with the Quad, which is, of course, is the other parties that are Japan and India, that minilateralism is showing that, democracies in the Indo-Pacific are going to coordinate together and say that we are not going to put up with autocratic outreach and certainly bad behavior. Having said that, I think it's important that AUKUS is not an attempt to encircle China. What the world wants is what everyone thought China would do, which is that there would be a peaceful rise. I think ultimately no nation has facilitated the rise of China more than the United States. Richard Nixon, recognized the regime in '72. Clinton brought them into the World Trade Organization despite heavy opposition from trade unions in the United States and in Europe and other parts of the world. And Obama, pressed Xi to honor his word in terms of IP agreements, in terms of preventing theft, despite them ramping it up the whole way through. So, the rise of China has been facilitated, hoping that they would become peaceful, if not democratic, certainly peaceful. And unfortunately, the evidence to date is that that's not happening. And so what AUKUS is about, and other minilateral groups like the G7, like the Democracy Summit, are saying, well, we're going to coordinate. I'm a unionist. How do you deal with a bully in the backyard? You gang up and you say, well, we're going to stand together and we're not going to allow this. But at the same time, we absolutely want China to be a responsible, well-thinking nation in the Indo-Pacific.
Right. It's and you alluded to this earlier, right, when you talked about how we landed in World War I, and that we don't want to follow that same behavior where we have this classic national security dilemma, right, where each side is arming themselves more heavily, and you have an arms race, and then before you know it, you end up in conflict. So that said, President Biden is meeting with President Xi virtually at the end of the month. And then you have the Democracy Summit as well. And it's funny because as fearful as I am of Chinese aggressive behavior, and as someone like myself who came from a sanctions background, when we tend to be a little bit hawkish, not militarily hawkish, in terms of using punitive measures to change behavior or deter behavior or affect a different outcome. So what would you like to see? This is a two-part question. First, what would you like to see out of the virtual conversation between President Biden and President Xi? I know that even with my tough stance, I'm relieved that they're having a conversation, that they continue to have that channel. And second, and same for the Democracy Summit. What would you like to see out of that? What are the ideal? What can we expect, and what can we hope for? What would be the best? And then the second part of the question is, are there other things that we can do? And we'll get back to AUKUS because we didn't finish this part. But are there other policies that the collective we, the international community, Australia, United Kingdom, US, France, others, can pursue to maintain this stability in the Indo-Pacific region and ensure that China doesn't pursue military aggression?
So there's a lot there, but I'll do my best. But so I think firstly, you're right. It's very good. We need Xi Jinping, Joe Biden, and whoever is the president of the United States, whoever is the president of the Chinese Communist Party of China, to be talking, right? That's good. Now, I think comparisons to the Cold War are always dangerous, and certainly, we need to be careful of those. But, one of the things that did exist was the so-called red phone, right, to stop miscalculations between the two sides. Unfortunately, the CCP have sort of resisted that. And I think, a little bit of that is they enjoy sort of operating in what we call the gray zone, which is that they sort of, push out and kind of cause problems, whether it's cyber incursions or, using their fishing fleets to sort of, to jump into other nations' waters, or sort of, fly sorties over their regional partners, they're enjoying that strategic ambiguity to kind of do a bit of bullying, and right up to the level of saying, well, we know that there'll be no kinetic response, no bombing or shooting to this response. And it's made it very difficult for democracies to know how to respond to that. So I think, at the beginning, though, we should absolutely be talking. And I think Biden, hopefully, will be making it very clear that the United States is back in the game of alliances. And I think one of the most regrettable things under President Trump was that it was more of a America first, but America alone. And so, one of the United States' great resources is its alliance system. And going back to that, analogy about unionism, I think we're all stronger together. And pulling together under the umbrella of a US-led global alliance system, I think, is a way to keep, bad behavior in check from all actors, be it CCP or Russia or others. So I think, making it clear that the United States is back in the game of alliances is very important. Leading into the Democracy Summit, I think the idea of it's good. I think it's a really good idea. What is it going to be? No one is 100% sure. The danger, of course, is that it's going to be, it ends in motherhood statements. I hope not. I hope it does at least have some level of policy coordination where we're working towards something. I mean, there are things that we can look at. You're an expert in sanctions. I think Magnitsky legislation is an important thing that we should be looking at in terms of saying we are not going to allow human rights violations in the world, and we're not just going to turn a blind eye in terms of trade. And there are other things, right? We've got the Beijing Olympics coming up. I think we should be talking about the Uyghurs ahead of that. It'd be a shame, I think, to let the CCP have a great propaganda victory in the way that Putin had a great propaganda victory at the 2018 FIFA World Cup, Soccer World Cup, or Football World Cup for people. Okay, everyone's yelling at me. Probably they're saying I said football and soccer, but we say soccer in Australia. But, I think they are big set pieces that regimes enjoy, like autocratic regimes. Well, all nations like them. But I think we should be brave and say we're going to call you out in the human rights violations. So that's one idea. And then there's other basics as well. Like, we can add Taiwan into the CPTPP. I know the United States, despite it being an Obama initiative, regrettably pulled out of the TPP. But I think we'd like to see the United States back in. But I think certainly we should champion Taiwan's inclusion in that. It's allowed to trade with other nations, and its economy is an economy that would pass the tests to join. So there's a few ideas.
These are great ideas. They're great ideas. I mean, I think right now, and you alluded to this earlier, where we're all struggling. I think in the United States in particular is struggling with figuring out the best policies to affect change for the better with the Chinese regime, right? And opening things up for trade and hoping that things there would transition to democracy didn't exactly work, right? And looking at China, the Chinese regime in a more favorable light. And so, right, it's difficult finding this fine line where you're pursuing these more careful, cautious, punitive measures, or just efforts to increase the balance of power, which is obviously what AUKUS is about, and with the goal of stability, right, and not ruffling feathers. So let's turn back to AUKUS again, and talk a little bit about the French, which it was a kerfluffle is putting it lightly in terms of how things went down. You have, I'm going to mess this expression up, but you have your ear to the ground in Australia. So would love to hear your thoughts from there, as an Australian, as to how things went, how it could have been handled, and how it's continued, right? I mean, the French president still seems pretty upset about it. Please, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think kerfuffle it's one of the best dust-ups we've seen in foreign relations, I think, for a very long time. I mean, it's easy. It is regrettable, right? I think, there's I think I said this to you when we spoke on your show that, you can't break up a $90 billion marriage via text message, which is essentially what was happening with the cessation of that contract. And I think we had to, and that was Australia's obligation to handle that piece of the negotiations. There was a horns of a dilemma piece, though, as well, going back to the secrecy of AUKUS. It was tricky to get that timing right where you're holding that information tightly, but at the same time, managing the relationship with the French, that's hard. But of course, I imagine the French, they go, well, you clearly don't trust us to tell us this in secrecy. So there is a problem there, which again, not ideal. I think, President Macron, there's a lot of domestic politics in this, right? 90 billion sub deal is a lot of money for both nations. Now, look, the truth of the matter is that contract was not in a good place with Naval Group. Australia was unhappy, and then President Macron was told that by Scott Morrison earlier this year. But I do think that him calling him a liar at a public forum like that is a pretty big call. But interestingly enough, the polling on this, if you're a person that's into polling, I wasn't sure how it would play back home, but 47% of people say that they think Scott Morrison has embarrassed Australia internationally. So there's definitely been a bit of a view that Morrison did not handle this well. And I think we could have handled it better. Having said that, the ratcheting it up from, Macron's got an election next year. That's the truth of the matter. And he's maximising the political pain on Morrison for a political gain at home. That's politics. They're both politicians, and they would both know that. The truth of the matter as well is, when Australia was first looking at its submarines in 2016, nuclear subs were not on the table. Now, but when you looked at the scope of the what we were trying to do, describing the length of mission, the range and capability, we were essentially describing a nuclear sub or the greatest diesel sub of all time, which is what the French were trying to build us. But the thing that it missed a lot of its sort of, I suppose, benchmarks, and the contract did contemplate cessation if you went through gates where you were unhappy. So it's a really, really, it's a hell of a dust up. It's certainly regrettable. And I think the most regrettable bit about it, and this is where I think it would have been good between three parties relating to AUKUS, that, the French can be sensitive in terms of that relationship with the Anglosphere, so to speak. I think we needed to make sure that we landed that well, knowing that they'd be upset and saying, okay, what does a Constellation Prize look like? What does not embarrassing the French look like? Because, the French are an Indo-Pacific power. One of the advantages of that deal that we did, Malcolm Turnbull signed, was that we're going to get the French more engaged in the Indo-Pacific. As an Australian, we want the French engaged. They have 2 million citizens in the Indo-Pacific. And, again, that team of nations, they're a critical player in that. So it's not ideal. The CCP would be enjoying it, but I think overall interest and history will get us through, but it's going to be tricky. I don't know. Macron and Morrison aren't on each other's Christmas cards list, that's for sure.
That's for sure. I don't think so. I will say, having been in government for a long time, including at the White House, where we handled very tricky deals and maneuvered through multilateral partners on a range of issues, I was surprised myself when I saw what happened, because on one hand, I could understand why on the United States side, they said, listen, they probably said, hey, Australia, this is up to you to handle and to tell the French. But it does seem a little bit like a ball was dropped somewhere as well on the US side, just to follow up on that and make sure, because you don't want something like that backfiring on the US-French relationship either, when the French, like you said, are very important as an ally and as a partner on a wide range of issues to Australia as well, but to the United States, both from a bilateral standpoint as well as a multilateral standpoint. So that did surprise me. I can appreciate wanting things not to leak, and everything leaks so easily. And so, as you said, I was also really quite surprised at how they kept that under wraps. Let's talk a little bit about the nitty gritty of AUKUS in terms of actually setting it up, right? And you've mentioned to me before, and I thought this was fascinating, about the infrastructure in Australia to have this kind of nuclear technology, the jobs that it could create. Tell us a little bit about that and the advantages and also the challenges here for Australia in this deal.
So one of the key components of the French deal was that there was going to be domestic build of submarines in Australia. So Australia built its Collins-class submarines with a Swedish partner in the 90s. in a city called Adelaide, which is in the south of Australia, at the bottom. So one of the key components was, look, if you're going to spend close to $100 billion, you want to make sure there's a lot of jobs in that, right? High quality jobs. It's a high tech industry. You can do a lot of, you can build an industry out of it. And if you have a continuous build, you avoid what they call the valley of death, which is, you have lots of activity, then you have to de-skill because you haven't got enough, and then you kind of have to ramp up again. If you have continuous build over a lifetime of them, it makes sure that you're continually building those skills. So that was what was supposed to happen under the deal with Naval Group. That's what was not happening. But of course, the challenge of building a nuclear submarine is probably degrees higher. Australia doesn't have a nuclear industry for peculiar reasons. So despite being basically the Saudi Arabia of uranium, we've never had nuclear power. And it's always been politically contentious. It's increasingly being discussed at home, but certainly one of the things Morrison made clear was that if Australia requires, or when Australia requires nuclear submarines, we're not going to have nuclear power generation at home. And so one of the advantages, and this has been getting right into the weeds on this, people said, well, you made the French convert. So the submarine the French were building was a nuclear sub that we were asking them to convert into a diesel sub for us. So they build nuclear subs, but it's low enriched in uranium. And so that means essentially you need to have domestic enrichment capability. So to have those submarines as a nuclear, you'd have to make the even bigger call of obtaining domestic nuclear power, which politically would be challenging, I think, though increasingly more probable, certainly challenging. So Morrison, I think, was very keen to say, okay, we're going to have nuclear subs, but they're not going to be, we're not going to have nuclear energy. And so one of the advantages of submarines made under AUKUS, or the Astute class by the Brits, or the Virginia class by the United States, is that they are high enriched uranium, and so they only have to essentially be fueled once. So you fuel them at the beginning, and then essentially they run the entire time. But of course, the politics of this is still going to be, there's going to be a lot of jobs politics. And so Morrison's also made it clear he wants domestic build. And, essentially when Tony Abbott, one of the reasons Tony Abbott lost his job as Prime Minister to Malcolm Turnbull was that he had agreed to buy submarines directly from the Japanese without any domestic build component, which caused a backlash politically in a lot of seats where those jobs are relied on. And so it's a very sensitive political issue. And, our union has a lot of people that would work in that sector. So it's important to make sure you do have domestic build. But one of the things people are saying is, hang on, how are we going to do this? We've got Collins class is running, it's old and it needs to be replaced. We've cancelled our French submarine contract. We're talking about having nuclear submarines now in the late 2030s. And going right to the beginning of our conversation, the Indo-Pacific's heating up. So there's a lot of challenges there. But I think, we're going to need to look creatively. We're going to need to think creatively in terms of jointly crewing, leasing United States or United Kingdom subs, buying directly, and also building at the same time. So it's going to be a very, very hard policy challenge. But, these circumstances demand it.
Right. It's going to be a tricky few years. And so in closing, we have 5 minutes left. So for one last question, let's try and look ahead a little bit, if you had a crystal ball. And how do you think, do you think that AUKUS is going to tame a little bit the assertive Chinese behavior that you're seeing in the Indo-Pacific? Have you already seen signs of it? Or do you expect that on one hand? And on the other hand, are there other things, the neighbors in the Indo-Pacific region, countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, etc., Taiwan, are there other efforts they should be pursuing to protect themselves in a way where, like you said, where we can pursue stability without circling China?
Yeah, so I think the critical piece for AUKUS is that it needs to land something relatively quickly. I think Macron said churlishly, you guys have an agreement to look at an 18-month study. Good luck. So, I think 18 months feels like too long to me. I think we need to be really making decisions quickly. I don't understand why it should take so long, frankly. Like, I mean, we're going to buy a Virginia-class submarine. We're going to buy, you know, make the decision, right? So, are we going to build that? What are we going to do? So get on with it. I think AUKUS needs to get meat on the bone quickly. And what I mean by meat on the bone quickly, I think this side of, you know, 2025 needs to be. And you see, if that were to happen, if there was a Australian flagged nuclear submarine patrolling the northern, you know, entry points to Australia, that would be enormously valuable to Australia, and it would change the strategic sort of safety of Australia. So I think that it's very important. But, you know, if it sort of devolves into, well, it's not landing anything, then I think that'd be problematic. So I think the results of AUKUS would be critical. In terms of what else we can do, I think it's about coordination. And so what China, you know, looks to do is it tries to take everyone on unilaterally, right? It wants bilateral relationships, and it wants to bully you one-on-one. And, you know, China, you know, one of the cadres in the Chinese Communist Party said China's a big country, other countries are small countries, and that's just a fact. But, you know, again, strength in numbers. So when a nation's being trade coerced like Australia is at the moment, how can we think about ways to make sure that there's offsets or a buyers club or something to say, okay, you know, other countries are going to ramp up their increase of Australian wine, et cetera, or what have you. You know, how do we make sure that people aren't one out on their own having to deal with a belligerent CCP on their doorstep? So you've got to devise ways to say, we're all in this together. You're not going to be coerced. And so when you've seen joint freedom of navigation exercise in the region where Japan's been participating, Indonesia, India, I mean, these are hugely profound shifts, and it was unthinkable that India would participate in a freedom of navigation exercise, but they did it. Why? Because, you know, they had a fracas on their border, and they're like, well, okay, this is what we need to do. So, you know, the CCP is driving everyone into each other's arms. And so through their own paranoia that they're going to be encircled, they're making everyone go, well, we've got to get together. And, you know, hopefully there is still time to turn back. It doesn't need to be like this. But the person that needs to change his behavior is Xi Jinping.
That's right. It's there's strength in numbers. I have, you know, from my vantage point, haven't yet seen Xi Jinping be convinced in taming his behavior, but perhaps that's just, you know, from what I see from the press. But I am hopeful, and we'll see. Misha, this insight has been so helpful and so just amazing to hear from you. I know we all appreciated your valuable insight, your accent as well, of course.
Well, thank you. I'm a little bit sick, so apologies. I've sounded very raspy, but
I thought it sounded great. I'm sure everybody agreed. For those of you who want to hear more from Misha or me, please subscribe and follow Misha's podcast, The Diplomates Podcast. It's awesome. And of course, go to YouTube to subscribe to Oh My World, and you'll hear us bantering even more. Thank you so much.
Thank you.